Well, here I am in winter time and I've got my heat pump here, busy working away. It's nice and warm inside, but it's quite cold outside, as you can see by the frost which is forming on the heat exchange fins. So in this video we are going to be talking about the heat pump performance, how it's been faring this autumn and into the winter. In that video, we are going to just have a look at how it's changed my behavior, how it's affected my comfort, and then we're going to look at some of the performance issues which I've raised in previous videos, see what I've got in terms of an idea on how to overcome these issues. But as you can see, it's now a very frosted over looking heat pump. Plenty, let's just have a look down here. Plenty of ice. This is all ice. There's about a centimetre of ice here, and you've got some icicles here. So it's doing its job very well. So we're going to go inside and talk about things in a bit more detail. Now, this is a relatively minor advantage, but the heat pump, it means that when it's in operation, you don't really hear it all that much. The boiler that used to be there, you could hear that, and it would wake me up in the morning time when it came on. It was quite a loud fan which came on, and it certainly made its presence felt. The heat pump here, you can hear the compressor unit. You can't really hear too much going on in there. You can sometimes hear the circulation pump when it's just started up, because it starts up at maximum speed and then it ramps down to a much lower speed. But the compressor, what you hear the lower frequency sound coming through the ground. It's not particularly noticeable. If you know that it's the heat pump, then you can hear it. So yes, there is some noise, but you don't hear anything in your bedroom at all. But you can hear it in the lounge and you can hear it in the kitchen, especially if you've got no other noise whatsoever. So this is the total amount of heat which has been produced, hot water and central heating, 5.3 megawatt hours. And if we have a look at the meter here, 1.5 megawatt hours of input. So that is a seasonal coefficient of performance, which is about 3.5. Not bad for both heating and hot water. Let's go and see how those numbers compare with my analysis tool. So let's see how my analysis tool compares. You can see power consumption is quite a lot less and the SCOP is not so favourable. So I would trust the figures which I've just seen from the heat pump and the meter much more. You can see here we've got missing data. So that is going to be part of the reason why the power consumption information is so different. But not only that, we've got some questionable data here. You can see here I've been away from home at that time, and you can see here as well, again I was away from home, and what goes on is that when your heat pump goes back into idle mode, it stops updating values going to my Raspberry Pi. And sometimes the values for power consumption are frozen at the last value. And it's only power consumption and outdoor air temperature which are particularly afflicted with this. But anyway, this is my analysis tool, and yeah, it's not entirely perfect when it comes to power consumption. So what I have for you today are 3 interesting use cases. And the first one I want to show you is the coldest day that we had this heat pump in operation. This was the 24th of November. We had a low point of minus 8.5 degrees Celsius. Now this day is interesting for 2 reasons. Number 1, how the heat pump performed at this time, but also number 2, how the heat pump performed due to the fact that I wasn't at home. And it's quite different. So let's see what you can see here. I was away from home, so the whole heat pump was in holiday mode. So it was designed to maintain a temperature of 12 degrees. So it would drop down to 12 degrees and then the heat pump would kick in, get up to 13 degrees, and then repeat the cycle. And it would do so quite frequently on a cold night, on a cold day like this one. Now, the trouble with this is that this is behaving in a thermostatic manner. And thermostatic manners are not very efficient at all. Generally speaking, a weather-dependent temperature set point for your leaving water temperature relies on a constant temperature set point for your internal house temperature, and that's going to be 21 degrees Celsius. So if you then change the set point of your house down to 12 degrees Celsius in this instance, then you need a different weather-dependent curve in order to get the most efficient use out of your heat pump. And unfortunately, the Daikin does not have the option of having a reversionary weather-dependent heat pump curve for different temperature set points which you may have in your house. But anyway, let's have a look at this regime here from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. and then 0400. Here we go. So what you can see here, first of all, is that we get some produced heat from the heat pump. And then it says, oh, it's too cold. And why is it doing this? Why is the heat pump coming in and then coming off and then reverting to backup heater here? Because this is pretty much 3 kilowatts exactly, 3.5 kilowatts. That's your backup heater. That's your 13 amps. Let's go here. This here is a diagram which shows you the different operating regimes. And anything below 18 degrees Celsius in terms of leaving water temperature is a backup heater mode only. Look here. So this is backup heater only operation, no outdoor unit operation. So for cold heating mediums, it will use the backup heater first before switching on your compressor. And that's not very efficient, of course, but it's also hard-coded. And even if you have set backup heater to restricted mode in your settings, it will still automatically use the backup heater in this instance. So as you can see, leaving water temperature here, it rises and then it falls and then it rises again. And you can see it's kind of dropped the ball. The produced heat from the compressor just sort of switches off. So as you can see, the temperature falls and then it decides to put the backup heater on again. And it does a bit of a fumbling job of getting the leaving water temperature up. But eventually it settles above 20 degrees Celsius and then it's just the compressor. As you can see, the compressor output is about 2.7 kilowatts here. It's not 100%. But it is enough to bring the leaving water temperature up to 30 degrees before we get a defrost cycle. And frankly, you don't need too much of a leaving water temperature to start your room temperature from rising up. In fact, you can do it with a leaving water temperature of 20 degrees, but you'll never have a leaving water temperature of 20 degrees. The lowest configurable leaving water temperature for your heat pump is about 25 degrees. So you're still going to have a thermostatic kind of characteristic of operation if you leave your house in holiday mode. And this is the coldest night that we've had so far, -8 degrees. But have a look at the we'll have a look at the coefficient of performance in this operating regime here. I've added 2 new lines. This one here, this is the flow return temperature difference, and then we've also got this one. So this blue line is the coefficient of performance 10-minute average, and this one is the deviation from the published figures. And there aren't too many published figures. There's about 5 figures for different temperature ranges, and there's one at -10, one at -2, one at 2 degrees, one at 7 degrees, and those are the only regimes I've got for measuring for published figures. But as you can see, we're doing better than the published figures here. So we've got a coefficient performance of about 2.4. Now the thing is that the higher the leaving water temperature, the lower the coefficient of performance. So we've got a set point of 35 degrees, which we never reach. And as it rises up, the coefficient of performance gradually starts dropping down. Now, it never reaches it because we reached the cutout temperature before we reached the leaving water temperature. So that is the first operating regime. Now, I do think that Daikin should update the configurable options on this by virtue of a firmware update. It should be possible to have a different weather compensation curve for holiday mode. After all, I still want the heat pump to run efficiently when I'm not at home. In that particular day, I was using about 15 kilowatt hours to run the heat pump, and that drained the battery during the expensive part of the day. So I was almost using expensive electricity even though I wasn't at home. So here's the next example. This is the 11th of December. This was the coldest night that we had whilst I was at home. So this was representative of a night with normal operation. So as you can see, we've had a temperature maintained at around 20 to 21 degrees Celsius all day long. And it does a pretty good job of maintaining that temperature. It hits a high point of about 21.1 degrees Celsius. It drops down. I generally have a lower temperature of 20 degrees Celsius for the nighttime, and you can see it's falling down and then it kicks in here. This is the regime where we've got a low temperature of minus 5.5 degrees Celsius. Let's zoom in on that regime here. This is a little bit more interesting. So first of all, you can see we didn't need the backup heater. It was using the compressor. The reason it was using the compressor was because the temperature of your leaving water never dropped below 18 degrees in this particular example. So that's good, but you can see there's quite a lot of energy which is being put in here, and this is compensating for the fact that the heat pump was switched off for the previous 3 hours. And all told, we can see in this regime here, we've got a coefficient of performance of about 2.4. That's not bad for a cold winter's night, minus 5.5. There are plenty of nights when it gets that cold, at least in historical terms anyway. We're slightly better than the published figures in this particular example. But let's have a look at the next night, 12th of December. You can see we've got no problem at all maintaining 20 degrees during the course of the whole night. And it remained at minus 5 degrees for quite a long period of the night here. And we had a couple of defrost cycles here. And there was about one and a half hours between the defrost cycles. Sometimes we can get some very frequent cycling going on, and a lot of it is down to the humidity of the air on that particular night. The more humid the air is, the more frequent the defrost cycles are going to be. But this is characteristic of your defrost cycle. It will dump your leaving water temperature, and then you'll see you're losing heat. It's the heat transfer is going from your heating medium back into your refrigerant, and then that's used to remove the ice from the compressor. So in this particular example, you've got your coefficient of performance is about 2.9, which is not bad actually. 2.9, but it's reduced down to about 2.5 on account of these defrost cycles. They do take a lot of energy out of the system, so it's worth bearing that in mind. And you can see throughout the whole day, even when the temperature is above freezing point, you'll still get a defrost cycle because the temperature of your coils are lower, they're below freezing point. So that is a basic anatomy of the coldest day when I have been in operation. And as you can see, we've had no trouble maintaining good temperature inside the house. Now, one thing I will say is that I have not been using this firewood for burning any of this kind of wood. This pile of wood, which I've had here, has been sitting in this crate since the beginning of October. We had a very cold night a couple of nights ago. It went down to about -5.5 degrees Celsius, and it never went above -1 during the daytime either. Did I feel like needing to use this wood stove? Absolutely not. I have used this wood stove for other purposes though. I have simply been using it to get through 3 years worth of accumulated kindling, which has just been piling up around my wood stores outside. And I've got two choices when it comes to kindling. I can either take it to a recycling centre at great cost in terms of driving and so on, or I can burn it. And that's what I've been doing. I've been burning a lot of kindling. But it doesn't really contribute much in terms of heating, but it does still contribute a little bit. More to the point though, it does create a lot more cleaning work in terms of keeping my wood stove and my chimney clean. Now, one of the major disadvantages with wood burning was that it would raise the temperature of the thermostat to the point of switching it off. And the consequence of that was that the top of the house was nice and toasty, but the bottom of the house was absolutely Baltic. So by having a heat pump and not using a wood burning stove, the uniformity, the temperature gradient throughout the house is much reduced. So no, I'm not enjoying the 30 °C temperatures which I previously had in the lounge, but at the same time, the temperature in my bedroom is maintained at about 21 °C. Same with the bathroom. That was also a very cold room, and it was not very comfortable having a shower in that place. Now it's much more comfortable. So this date is a very interesting date indeed, 6th of November. And why is this date interesting? Well, here, if we scroll down, we have got two different performance regimes happening. If we go back up here, you can see that the temperature has been fairly consistent throughout the whole day. It's been about 8 degrees, rising up to 9 degrees in the afternoon. So not a particularly varied day, but in between the good and the bad performance regime, the heat pump switched off for a brief period of time. So what we're going to do is look to see why we were getting such good coefficients of performance beforehand, COP of about 6, and why we were getting such a terrible coefficient of performance. COP was going down to about 3 in many instances after the heat pump came back on. So we'll zoom into this range here, 11 till 12. Here we are. You can see quite clearly that the input power on the left side is much lower. We've got about 129 watts, and then occasionally we will get 418 watts every 2 minutes. So about 1 in 4 for about 1 in 4 times we get this peak. On the right hand side, however, we can see the input power is about 300 watts, and then peaking at 414 watts here. So there's something different going on here. Now, I raised this performance regime with my installer, and he's saying right here that the outdoor heat exchanger can't be fully utilized if the indoor heat exchanger can't reject the heat. He's saying that the modulation is bouncing off minimum capacity. So this is worth exploring in a little bit more detail. Now, one of the things I've got here is just a little bit of an illustration. So when it comes to weather dependent set points, the warmer your ambient air temperature, the lower your leaving water temperature. My leaving water temperature is set to 25 degrees Celsius. And ideally, you want to have a temperature gradient of 5 degrees between your leaving water and your return temperature. But you can see the problem here. This return temperature is thermodynamically impossible when your room temperature is 21 degrees. You cannot have a return temperature that is colder than your room temperature. So what happens actually is that your return temperature is probably 23.5 degrees Celsius. At that point, you've only got a temperature gradient of 1.5 degrees. So I think we need to go to this piping diagram to understand what's going on. So in the inefficient case, what I think we're seeing is this compressor running all the time. We're seeing 320 watts with occasional peaks at 415 watts. You've got this fan unit here, you've got this compressor unit here, and when they're both running together, you will have a minimum flow going through here, and then you have a heat exchanger here. So you have compressed gas going through here, and not all of the heat is being transferred to the heating medium, the water. The consequence is that when it comes back to your evaporator coil, you don't just have liquid, you also have gas as well. So you don't have a full phase change going on from gas to liquid. And this is a problem because when you get to your evaporator coils, it splits. So what you'll find is that your liquids go down one capillary tube and your gases will hog your remaining capillary tubes. And that means that only a sixth or a third of your heat exchanger has actually got liquid running through it, absorbing latent heat from the air. And that's not an optimal situation. And the reason it's not an optimal situation is because this compressor is running all the time at the minimum. That's what's going on. And that's what's going on in that situation. So my installer is right. There is a minimum output for this compressor. But the thing is that, I'm a control systems engineer. I also know he's wrong. There is an even lower minimum for every single motor, and that is off. You can still run refrigerant through here when this compressor is switched off. If you look at Exhibit J, this is a compressor accumulator. This will provide a reserve of refrigerant needed to keep the flow of refrigerant going when your compressor is switched off. And the flow rate is going to be controlled by your expansion valve, which I think is Y1E. Is it Y1E? Yeah, electronic expansion valve. This will control your flow rate. And so long as this regime exists, where your compressor kicks in every 2 minutes, as we've seen, you can actually achieve a full phase change through here at a much reduced flow rate, simply because your compressor is only running for 25% of the time at the minimum rate. That's how you can do it. So then going back to here, you can see that there are no particular differences between the left side and the right side in terms of environmental conditions. Let's go up to heat pump diagnostics. You can see here the expansion valve always starts at 45 degrees and then ramps back in. But you can see that from about 1 p.m. onwards, it's got back to the minimum position. And you can see here, the expansion valve is pretty much at the low point anyway. And same with the flow rate. The flow rate has dropped back down to the minimum rate. And there's no difference between the before and after case. So there is an operation mode which is sometimes activated and sometimes not. And I've not got to the bottom of it. But if we zoom out, this is where hacking the configuration to match the constraints comes into play. When we have temperatures which are lower, we have flow temperature set points which are higher. And my experience is that if we have a flow temperature which is 30 degrees or higher, we're going to have an efficient use of the heat pump. So therefore, it stands to reason that what we need to do is set the minimum leaving water temperature to 30 degrees on the weather dependent curve. There is, however, a bit of a problem. Now, one of the things you can see is that we've got a set point minimum flow temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. And realistically, I want to bring that up to 30 degrees. But the problem I've got is that I want to reduce the temperature down here to 5 degrees. Unfortunately, you can't. You can only go as far as 10 degrees here, and you can't go any further than that. And that means I have to have two different modes of operation, and I have to manually change between the two. So I'm just going to discard these changes here. You can have the set point in weather dependent mode or fixed. And what I'll need to do is change it to fixed mode for milder temperatures and then see how the heat pump reacts. So what I did was that I waited for a mild day and I set the flow temperature set point to 30 degrees. And here is our mild day. It is the 15th of December. And you can see we've got temperatures which are hitting 12.5, 13 degrees at times in the early afternoon. And what I did the day before is that I just set the flow point temperature to 30 degrees. Let's have a look, see what happened with the outputs. You can see in the nighttime we had a coefficient performance of about 6. This is stunning. And this is all just simply by stopping the temperature of the leaving water from dropping below 30 degrees for mild temperatures. During the middle of the day, we were getting up to 8 as a coefficient of performance. But look what happened here at 1:30. The heat pump stopped briefly and then it restarted. And then the coefficient of performance dropped down to about 4. So let's look in this regime here for a closer look. So if we go to here, 12 till 2. I was really tempted to make a presentation at this stage and say that raising the leaving water temperature was the panacea in all of these instances, but actually it's not. What we're seeing is more of what we had on the 6th of November. We've got the compressor turning off and then turning on periodically. And that's the same behavior as before. And whereas here we've got the compressor running at a minimum continuously. And the output between the before and after case is exactly the same. So you go here, you can see the output here is exactly the same as the output here. So here's the thing, and this actually informs my opinion. For a given minimum output, as the ambient air temperature warms up, then the capacity to generate higher output increases. That's your improvement in coefficient of performance. But in order to accommodate that capacity, your radiator temperatures also have to increase with higher ambient air temperatures. You don't need the radiators to increase with higher ambient air temperatures, but to get that efficiency, you need to increase the flow temperatures. So in this instance, my conjecture is that if I increase the leaving water temperature from 30 to 35 degrees Celsius in this regime, then even at the minimum flow rate here, we would be able to get some much better, some spectacular outputs here. And of course, the consequence will be that your heat going into your system would increase, which would warm up your house even faster. And it will warm it up to the point where it cuts out at 22.5 degrees. And that's probably going to be the way you need to do it. So weather compensation curves are not as straightforward as you imagine. And it boils down to the fact that sometimes this heat pump can operate below the minimums by virtue of modulating the compressor to start and stop. And other times it can't. And I don't have any control over this. The fact that I'm able to run my central heating system with a flow temperature no higher than 30 degrees for ambient temperatures higher than 5 degrees Celsius, that's a stunning result. These radiators, they're about 3 times the rated output of my original radiators, and in physical terms, they're only a little bit longer and a little bit higher and twice as thick. And they don't really take up much space at all. And yet conventional wisdom is that you need to have underfloor heating in order to have a radiator system which is flowing at no higher than 30 degrees Celsius. I've now proven that this is incorrect. But nonetheless, we're not getting good efficiencies out of our heat pump at warmer temperatures until just recently. And it's very interesting to just see how the heat pump is operating in different regimes. Now, ultimately, in terms of both situations, adjusting the weather dependent curve down to 5 degrees, but also in terms of seeing this modulated start-stop of the compressor, we're going to need a firmware update. Now, I've had 2 firmware updates for the Daikin unit, and their way of doing firmware updates is annoying. Number one, you can't find any information about firmware for the Daikin units on the internet. There are no release notes. If you type in Daikin Altherma firmware, you won't find any release notes. You won't find any information about it. If you type in the specific model name and number for your compressor unit or indoor unit, again, you're not going to find any firmware release notes. The only thing you will get is a notification on your Daikin app that a firmware update is available. And when you try and update it, more likely than not, you will find that the update has failed for some inexplicable reason. And you have to attempt this multiple times before the firmware update has actually succeeded. So Daikin certainly does have room for improvement. And sadly, I don't think Daikin actually watched this video. So the chances are we're not going to see any improvements on account of my observations, which is a bit of a sad indictment of the way things are. So I have got this tree which sheds lots of pine needles every single autumn time in November. And that's where my heat pump is. So let's go and take a look at the back of the heat exchanger. So this is the situation we're faced with. We got lots of pine needles. They favour accumulation at the bottom of the heat exchanger. You can remove a lot of it, but this is very wet. It does not react too effectively to a vacuum cleaner, as I've discovered. And the other thing you need to be mindful of is that sometimes you get a line of ice right at the bottom there, so that can make removal difficult. But here we are. The evaporator temperature is above freezing point for the time being, so it is a manual job to remove these, and you do want to remove these because if you don't, eventually organic matter builds up over time. It never goes away, it rots down, especially under this constantly wet environment. There we go. Believe me, this pine tree is a devil. I know the best solution is to chop it down, but it's not my property. But the good news is that you don't get any broad leaves sticking themselves to the back of your heat pump. Not for any length of time. I've simply not seen it. Now, before I finish this video, I just want to give a shout out to somebody called Merv. I'd like to say thank you very much, Merv, and I really do hope you enjoy your brand new Tesla Model Y. If you don't already know, I do have links on some of my videos for Tesla referrals. You can get £500 off a brand new Tesla if you use my referral code, and you'll find a link in the description. So in the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again very soon.